everyone. My name is Aaron Danis. I'm one of the non-resident fellows here. When I say non-resident, I really mean it. I live in Delaware, so southern Delaware, close to Ocean City. So I just drove in this afternoon. But it was important to come in today because a former colleague of mine from National Intelligence University is speaking tonight. And before we do that, I have to give you the announcement ahead of time that this is sponsored by the Institute of World Politics. If this is your first time here, we are a School of National Security, Intelligence, and International Studies. We offer doctoral and PhD programs. We have 8 master's degree programs. And it says 18 certificates. I'd lost count a few years ago, so I guess 18 is the right number now. If you're interested in learning more about us, you can just go to one of our staff out here afterwards, or you can go to iwp.edu. We'd like to thank all of our supporters who help make our events program possible. To support the work of IWP, you can go to our website and go to the donate link, and you can help out that way. Tonight's event is being brought to you by the International Association for Intelligence Education, or IAFE. That's a heck of an acronym. It's one of the longer ones in Washington, D.C. We have an Alpha student chapter here. We were the very first student chapter. And we are in our recruiting mode right now. So if there's anybody here who's a student who wants to join our student chapter afterwards, I will point out our officers and you can go talk to them. Today we're going to hear a talk from Captain Bryan Leese on his book, At Sea Against the Soviet Fleet. And I'm really excited about this book. Captain Leese was a career intelligence officer with extensive experience in operational intelligence, or what we used to call Opintel, including key roles supporting ground combat operations and tours at sea, including as the N2 of the Bataan Amphibious Ready Group and the George H.W. Bush Carrier Strike Group. He's held senior positions across the intelligence community, most notably as Chair, Defense Intelligence Department, when I knew him, at the National Intelligence University, and as Branch Chief, Trans-Regional and Northwest Africa in the J2 of Africa Command. And that was during the 2011-2012 Libya crisis. Before joining the Joint Forces Staff College in September of 2023, he served on the faculty of the Naval War College Joint Military Operations Department. He holds a PhD in War Studies from King's College in London and lives in Chesapeake, Virginia with his wife Elizabeth. Today was his first day off furlough, and he took a day of leave to come up and give his talk because nobody knew when furlough was going to end. So with that, please join me in welcoming Captain Bryan Leese.
Okay, I too have to put out a disclaimer. Make sure I get this one right. The views expressed in this book and in what I'm going to talk about today are those of the author, myself, and do not reflect the official policy or position of the Department of the Navy, Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. So that's my disclaimer. Keep us all safe here. Well, thanks for having me. This is the first book talk I'm going to do, and hopefully there'll be many more. This book is definitely a labor of love. Not only is it representative of the things I saw over my 28-year career, but also the things that I learned from interviewing over 30 retired flag officers, also a lot of enlisted personnel and civilians that served in naval intelligence over the years. One thing that was very important to me, and one thing that I noticed right away, was that this generation that fought this Cold War is slowly passing away. And I lost at least 2 of the people that I interviewed who were very helpful in writing this book during this process where they passed away. And so the quicker we can capture their observations, their understanding of that time period, a period of great power competition, I think the better we will be in our future as we continue what is now a new great power competition. So that leads me to kind of why did I write this book? Smet Levy, that is a Soviet destroyer, now part of the Russian naval fleet, and that's the USS Philippine Sea. That view was my view in February morning in 2017. Sunrise over the eastern Mediterranean Sea began. this account of the U.S. Navy's afloat operational intelligence evolution. On the gray horizon, closer than one once, rode the 1960s era Russian Federation Navy Kashin-class guided missile destroyer Smetlevy. She had spent the night jockeying for position, the USS Philippine Sea blocking her as she tried to penetrate the defensive screen of the aircraft carrier USS George H.W. Bush. Despite her 48 years of age, armed with 8 SSN-25 Switchblade anti-ship cruise missiles, the Smetlevy was still a tiger, a fast ship designed to go into harm's way against the U.S. Navy. She required constant surveillance, and a dedicated team of intelligence professionals working in several of Bush's intelligence bases tracked her and other Russian ships operating in the Eastern Mediterranean. The operational intelligence, or Opintel, provided from those spaces created a common intelligence picture supporting operations across 6 ships of the Bush Strike Group, the 6th Fleet, and the U.S. Navy's global naval operations. I leaned against the weather deck railing watching the Smetlevy. I reflected on an early December 2016 conversation with Commodore Andrew Benton, commander of the Royal Navy's newly formed HMS Queen Elizabeth Carrier Strike Group. He had been observing part of our war game in the intelligence spaces, and he asked why the U.S. Navy created a decentralized shipboard operational intelligence process. It seemed less efficient, he opined, than a centralized shore-based process that broadcast intelligence to afloat units. My answer had been unsatisfactory, foregoing the why for the how, delving into the technicalities of how we conducted operational intelligence, or what the Navy calls Opintel. I could not explain why we had spent 70 years developing the Opintel process the way we did. Nevertheless, here we were in the 21st century conducting power projection and intelligence operations similar to those conducted when I enlisted in the Navy 20 years earlier, and people like me were operating in the 1960s. These were the same operations the Navy had performed for years. Despite almost 50 years of career guidance, Navy intelligence officers were told to master their craft of Opintel. I still did not understand how my vocation came to be this way. Mastering Opintel systems and tradecraft did not equate to understanding its role. Part of the poor understanding comes from a lack of knowledge about how afloat Opintel evolved with the Navy. That was why I decided to write this book. I did not understand my own job and how we got to this role. And the more
Hold the mic over.
And the more I looked at it, the less I understood. And so that's really what started this. And to help me with that, I decided to seek a PhD and use this as the topic of that. And so that's what brought me to this point. I am going to give you a taste of what's in the book. I'm going to talk about some things, but the book is quite large, so there's a lot in it for a lot of different people to look at. So I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes, then we're going to do some questions, and hopefully you'll have a good idea of what the book is about. On the screen is an RA-5C Vigilante. President Kennedy wasn't in office 2 months before telling Congress, quote, "I strongly recommend that the Polaris submarine-launched ballistic missile program be greatly expanded and accelerated." Secretary of Defense McNamara reinforced the president's direction, modifying defense research and development and acquisitions towards ballistic missiles. In a memo that I found in the archives, he said, quote, "Let's face it, the fighter-bomber aircraft is becoming vulnerable. Therefore, we must have medium-range ballistic missiles." The change in atomic bomb delivery approach scuppered the aircraft-centric Navy's long-range bombing strategy. The Navy was out of the airborne strategic nuclear strike mission business, though it still had a tactical atomic strike capability. Their new strategic nuclear bomber was without its primary mission. Yet the RA-5 Vigilante, costly and relentlessly advertised as an altitude and speed record-setting aircraft, was about to enter the fleet. At $1.6 billion of today's money, the Vigilante project was too important to scupper. determining what to do with the Vigilante would be a pivotal decision for the Navy and Navy intelligence. Revolution is about technology, and evolution is about how organizations adapt to that technology, how they use that technology. The introduction of technology such as the RA-5C Vigilante, which was a collection platform that could outrun the sound of its own engines. It collected imagery using a ventral canoe system, as well as a forward camera, an aft camera. It had a side-looking radar that it could take pictures, and it collected signals intelligence all at the same time. And it could go Mach 2. And it was carrier launched, right? So it's big, it can go anywhere, and it's really important. Certainly that technology is interesting, but what's fascinating is how organizations adapt to that technology and how they adapt their organizational performance, their orientation, performance of their orientation to exploit that technology. And that's what's fascinating, and that's what the book really talks a lot about, is organizational change and adaptability and a learning Navy that fights this. The book uses 3 key technological revolutions as sparks, and then the evolutionary period between those sparks. The Vigilante and its Integrated Operational Intelligence Center, so the IOIC, that came with it, is one of those sparks. Another is the Ocean Surveillance Information System, or OSIS. And then the last one the book really focuses on is a program called Outlaw Shark. And I'm going to touch on all 3 of those programs today. The RA-5C collected vast amounts of imagery and signals intelligence, and all of that required an onboard intelligence center that could exploit, could process, exploit, and fuse all of that material. Rock Orr, William Rock Orr, Rock was his call sign, was an ensign in the Shangri-La in 1958. And this is an image of the Air Intelligence Center on the USS Shangri-La, an Essex-class carrier from World War II in 1958. It's small, it's cramped, has no electronics. And that was what they were using to present threat, I keep walking away from that, to present threats and to deliver the mission briefings and targeting materials that were needed. That small space. Orr said the best part of Shangri-La's air intelligence officer was that it was air conditioned. And that the junior officers who held access to it would sleep under the planning table, which is in the foreground. That the image is actually taken from on top of the planning table. And they would sleep there because it was the only space that was air conditioned. The old Essex-class carriers lacked air conditioning in the junior officer sleeping area, which Rock referred to as Boys Town. 1967, Rock comes back as a lieutenant commander. He's now the supervisor for the IOIC install on the forestall. Forestall never actually makes it into combat. She has a fire on the 2nd week that she is on Yankee Station. But Rock was in charge of putting that IOC together during their workup. He went to the XO and he asked if he could tear down a bulkhead between the new IOIC install and a stateroom. And the XO exclaimed, "Rock, you already have 3,000 extra square foot of space. Why do you need more?" Well, Rock, having talked to other IOC supervisors in the Saratoga and other ships that had already had the install, understood that he needed that extra space for some mapping equipment that he desperately wanted to install. That 3,185 square foot of extra space with this new install, and this is a diagram of the install, the Air Intelligence Center on Shangri-La would have been about this much of this. With the Vigilante, we get all of this. 3 bays to do everything from multi-sensor interpretation of the imagery, signals intelligence analysis, and most importantly, storage and retrieval of information. So now they had a bank They had a library of information they could use to conduct analysis and to compare imagery to other images that they had already had as part of their library, and then also reproduce some of this. One of the things that the ship was most upset about with Rock demanding more space was that to air condition all of this required 2 new distillation plants, as well as 2 additional 100-ton air conditioning units. The ship already operated. Did I kill it? The ship already operated at a deficit. It never made enough fresh water for all its needs and for the crew to have showers and drink and all that stuff. And now they were getting more distillation capability, but it was going to some Intel center that nobody knew anything about and nobody cared about. So the engineer, Rock told me, was the one who was most upset about all of this. So space equates to importance. On an aircraft carrier, space is valuable. If you're willing to dedicate 3,000 square foot of space on the gallery deck, which is the level where all the flag spaces are, where the admiral works, where combat is, then this must be something important. And the Navy understood just how important it was when Vietnam started. It also understood that they needed to include, there was a revolution of military affairs happening here where we were incorporating technology. Here is the EDP on board, right? Electronic Data Processing Center. You see the sailors sitting here. In the back we have computers, right? You didn't see that in the Air Intelligence Office. We got all these computers. That's a Q20 system, and those are magnetic tape machines. You have a teletype there that can output things, but also input things through tape so that they could bring in more data. That was the brains of the IOIC. It allowed them to do signals analysis while at the same time do imagery correlation with other things and store data and reports and all these other things. And then they had a whole room just of microfiche that had all of these reports. Right? So now you're no longer just talking about threats and targets. You now can build understanding about threats and new target development. And this is going to become significant. Most change occurs not during peacetime, but during war. And so the Vietnam War becomes what I call the anvil upon which organizational change through technology happens for the U.S. Navy and for Navy intelligence. Both the air war in the North and the counterinsurgency in the South became that anvil upon which organizational change was hammered out for the Navy. I think from a change perspective, using AI to create this image kind of gives you a sense of how new technology does change things, right? There is no way that Ensign Leese would have ever done something like this, right? I would have had a view graph, and that would have been as good as it was going to get. But now I have all kinds of new technology. And it is changing how intelligence organizations operate, just as all of this technology during the 60s and 70s changed it as well. So the air war in the North is a significant event for the Carrier Intelligence Center, because now we are in war. We're bombing targets, we're restriking targets, and all of this requires good reconnaissance, and most importantly, an understanding of a new integrated air defense system that the Soviet Union has sold to the North Vietnamese. The air war in the North forced the Navy and the Air Force to address Soviet-built integrated air defense systems, and this became a technical intelligence collection problem. The collection effort that included the use of drones, signals intercept, and constant revisions of operational intelligence's performance orientation to keep up with the changes. This was a counter IADS, and then a counter to those IADS. And so every time that we developed something new to counter the SA-2 SAM system or the AAA or the MiGs. They came up with some counter to that. So this is an ongoing, constant reflection. Again, rep after rep, set after set, hammering out a new organizational orientation. The image on the screen is of the Tan Ho Bridge system. In this case, one of the bridges in that system in the Tan Ho area. The main bridge, which was called the Dragon's Jaw, which was its nickname, it was actually the Tan Ho Bridge, is a classic example of the problem of intelligence-driven solutions. To destroy that bridge built by the Chinese in 1964, it was over-engineered, it was difficult to bring down, and the weapons we had did not suit the purpose. Intelligence had to be collected to understand its construction, to build new weapons, to destroy the bridge, but also to penetrate the IADs to get to the bridge to destroy it in the first place. And after years of attacking with large aircraft losses, the Dragon's Jaw was still operational. Vice Admiral David Richardson, new commander of Task Force 77, decided that that approach, that direct approach on the Tan Ho Bridge was not satisfactory. And that if he married up his operators with his intelligence officers, and they looked at a network analysis approach to not the bridge, but to the entire transportation network the North Vietnamese were using, they might be able to find a better solution. And they were able to find a better solution. They were able to attack less attractive bridges. Instead of attacking the big, sexy bridges that were on the target list, Richardson started attacking smaller bridges, some of them pontoon bridges that were only temporary, but they were very vulnerable. And in doing so, he actually trapped over 100 rail cars worth of ammunition and supplies between the Tan Ho Bridge and the exterior lines, where they were able to destroy them like a turkey shoot. He called that a force multiplier, that intelligence provided a force multiplier. The problem was that when Richardson left, so went his new operator to intelligence officer integration process, because it was never repeated again. That bridge lasted until 1972, when Lieutenant Commander Snuffy Smith, later an admiral, four-star admiral, downed that bridge with a new Fat Albert II with a TV screen guided missile system that was able to knock the bridge down. So what? It was down for less than 18 months. It was rebuilt, and the North Vietnamese forces crossed it en route to capturing Saigon in 1975. So again, technology, double-edged sword when it comes to these things. Richardson goes to 6th Fleet, where he's now the 6th Fleet commander. And when he gets there, he says that he felt that there was little useful intelligence available to him as the fleet commander, and that he did not want to be surprised by anything the Soviet Navy was doing in the Mediterranean. And at this point, the Soviet Navy had quite a force, not only in the Mediterranean, but also in the Atlantic and the Pacific. While the Navy was fighting a limited war in support of the land operations, the Soviet force grew unimpeded, and they had now a full blue water navy. Their 1970 O'Kane exercise showed just how vast and capable that navy was, and they did it again in the 1975 O'Kane exercise too. So we had an understanding of how far behind we had fallen. Richardson said there was plenty of intelligence, but not the type of eye-watering stuff that he had seen in DC. And for him, in Naples, Italy, he wanted to find a way to get access to that type of intelligence. This is becoming a decentralization of national intelligence down to the tactical level, where it's going to be used by the fleet commander. And they're going to do that through the Ocean Surveillance Information System, or OSIS system. Admiral Harfinger, the Director of Naval Intelligence at the time, and Admiral Moore, the CNO, visit Richardson and then agree that they would set up an OSIS facility. So a fleet ocean information surveillance information facility in Rota. And this made all the difference. And once that happened, every theater would get a FOCIF or a center, a FOCIC. And that decentralized this intelligence, and it made not only in an environment where intelligence officers were kind of a steel, sharpening steel, because now they're all in this shore facility, all looking at special intelligence at the highest classification levels, and then all sharing that with the aircraft carriers and the strike groups and the operators at sea, so that they're never going to be surprised. And this process, and then this reciprocal influence that occurs. So I'm at the FOSIF, I learn all about the Soviet Navy in intimate detail, I then transfer to a ship, and I take all that with me. And now I demand that type of response from the FOSIF, because I'm now at the point of the spear and I want that stuff. And that reciprocation is very much what shapes the organizational process of that. And it supports not only the operations that we're doing, but the activities and investments that are the foundation of deterrence. And so as we are tracking Soviet submarines and ships and what they're doing, wherever they go, there's a Navy ship there or a NATO ship there to see what they're doing. That creates a deterrence mechanism, right, where we hold at risk the things that they're operating, especially their second strike ballistic missile submarines. And that was why OSIS was such a valuable spark. But to implement OSIS, you needed a new way to man, train, and equip the intelligence people that were going to do that. They had to elevate from just threat presentation and targeting to now understanding all source analysis, all source fusion, and then how you disseminate that and how do you sanitize it so that the most important parts can be shared with the operator who doesn't have the clearance but needs the understanding. And that is something that is built out of that. And that creates a relationship with operator and intelligence officer that's going to be leveraged later on. And Admiral Bobby Inman, for example, transforms Opintel from just a task that intelligence officers do to the identity of the community. And it becomes a corporate brand. And he uses a talent management approach to make sure that the best Opintel practitioners are married up with up-and-coming admirals and to support them so that they understand the value of this level of intelligence support. And that way we are assured that the admirals that are out operating get the best intelligence they could get. And then also we kind of sell the need for more Opintel, right? More facilities, more collection. And that leads us to Outlaw Shark. That's the poster that was on the door of the Outlaw Shark program in Naples, Italy in the 70s. The idea was that the admiral should be able to plant one foot in a square of linoleum and his other foot in another square of linoleum on the flag bridge and be able to see on a screen the display of all of the Soviet ships and where they are, common intelligence picture, and where all of his ships were and what they were doing, a common operational picture. And then he should be able to share that with his commander so that now there is a transfer of understanding of the battle situation and also his intent on what he's going to do. It's very common for us to do that today. We have global command and control systems that allow us to do that, and we have mission command orders, and we have all those things that we talk about. But back in the 70s, that was hard to do. The Navy had two programs to try to do this. The first was a bootstrap program called Eclipse, and it was an HP computer, actually it was an HP calculator, that was able to read a machine-formatted message and plot all of those positions from a naval tactical display system onto a screen. So every time the Navy tactical display system would capture all of the tracks that it had created, transmit them through link 14 via this formatted message, the Eclipse would get that tape, right? It was punch tape that they would feed in, and then plot all those dots for you. Not very useful, but it was the beginning of this process. The formal process was Outlaw Shark. And the Outlaw program was a demonstration program meant to take national technical intelligence and draw it down to the tactical level. And they were trying to display how they could do that. And Outlaw Shark was really focused on over-the-horizon targeting and for the new Tomahawk anti-ship cruise missile. So this OTHT battle is what's driving this desire to create this common operational picture driven by a common intelligence picture. In the 1979 test, the Outlaw Shark system that was installed on Ranger 2.5, which was a P3, was able to transmit its airborne search radar picture of the Soviet Navy exercise in the southern Norwegian Sea via satellite communications back to the office in Naples, and then via data link to Fosif Rota, and from Fosif Rota via data link to Fosik, Norfolk, where Navy leadership watched the tracks populate and move within minutes of the actual detection of the ships at sea. So many people today recognize the global command and control system as that very thing. But back then it was just a demonstration, and they were trying to work out all the digital technologies that were going to make this eventually work. JOTS comes out of it, and then later we have global command and control system. So again, more organizational change occurs for the afloat intelligence officer, because now they're into tactical decision support. They're presenting the picture that the admiral is looking at. They're giving him understanding of it so that he can make better decisions more quickly than his adversary can. And that's a whole change from where we started in 1960, where we're just telling you they have this plane that can shoot you down and these are the targets you should bomb, to now making tactical decisions about over-the-horizon targeting and over-the-horizon battle. It's a whole different ball game, and it takes a new breed of intelligence officer to now take that revolutionary spark and evolve to something newer. And then finally, I just want to close with a few of the things that I think are most important from the book. I spent a lot of time exploring how innovation thrives in a military organization, specifically the Navy's operational intelligence community, Navy intelligence. I talk and emphasize an understanding of the why behind the systems. What were we trying to do with those systems? Why did we need those systems? And then why did we need an organization that could evolve with those systems and get to the operator's decision-making process that they needed? And then finally, what I came to a conclusion of was that Navy Intel was so successful in this adaptation, in this learning organization, because it used a coordination without hierarchy principle. Maybe it didn't understand that's what it was doing, but in organizational terms, that's what it was doing. So instead of somebody from above telling this organization you're going to do these things, the organization, through sailor modification and other things, starts to realign itself to the needs it sees that its commander has or maybe doesn't know he needs yet. And they automatically change themselves internally without telling anybody. It just happens. A lot of that happens to do with the intelligence officer for the strike group, so the N2, the ship's intel officer, and the air wing intel officer all working together to find solutions without hierarchy, right? They all have a mission that they want to achieve. They all have different roles. And they know that if they cooperate, they're going to be able to do those things better. And that's what they do in many cases. If it works, it's documented, it's passed on, as Rock Orr was passed on from other IOC supervisors about the IOC, and he incorporated that understanding into what he was doing. The same thing's happening here. There is never any doctrine written for how intelligence officers are supposed to operate at sea. It's all just passed down, it's all just a learning organization, it's all, and it's to that day. Today we do it. We have very little doctrine that really tells us what we're doing, and we make it up as we go along. And every organization at sea is different based on the character of the admiral they serve. And so the servant ethos becomes what drives, what is the glue that sticks the coordination without hierarchy into the right direction so that it doesn't splinter and go the wrong ways. And that's all I have for you.
All right, I'll let you run the questions from up there, but I get the first one. I get the first question.
Sure.
So, 1985, Year of the Spy, Walker Whitworth comes out that they've been selling U.S. cryptographic codes and information on U.S. cryptographic systems. Was there any concern that the Soviets are able to penetrate your ability to track them and that they were perhaps spoofing the U.S. Navy along the lines? This is, of course, now 40 years later.
So At the time, no. Nobody really knew, right? But what I do talk about in the book is that in the P3 community, which was trying to track all these Soviet submarines in particular, the Maritime Patrol and Reconnaissance Forces were noticing that it became more difficult to pick out Soviet signals. In the beginning, it was very easy. They could find those subs because they were loud and they were easy to find. And they could track them because of that. And as time went on through the 1970s, it started to become more and more difficult to pick out a propeller noise or more often than not, it was a valve or some kind of pump that was creating a frequency that they could detect from the ambient noise. So they knew something was going on. What was going on was Walker was selling them.
And that ring operated about 10 years, right? From mid-70s to 85 when they were caught, I think.
Yeah. More importantly, Walker was selling them the code so they could break our messages.
Yeah.
So whenever we expected something to be where we thought it was and it wasn't, then we knew that there was some spooking going on. And Admiral Brooks and Studeman talk a little bit about that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where they use in the Ocane 75 exercise, they have this roll of paper that they put up and hang in this room where they track every ship the Soviets had out for that exercise. And they're tracking and then they're looking at what they broke in code and what didn't match. And they're trying to figure out why that was. Part of that was because there was a spy, and it was Walker.
Thank you.
Sure.
I have 3 questions. I think, can everyone hear me?
Well, it's not you, it's the camera,
All right.
because they're recording this. And one question first, and then other people, and if other people are done, we can come back for another question.
So my questions are, how did Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, and the Cold War more generally affect U.S. and Soviet naval and military strategy? How did changes in technology, some of which you discussed, from Kennedy to Reagan affect U.S. naval intelligence and Cold War dynamics? And do you suspect the U.S.'s loss in the Vietnam War was due to tactical errors or strategic missteps?
Pick the one you think you can best answer based on your book.
What was the first one again?
The first one was about, how did the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, and the Cold War more generally affect U.S. and Soviet naval and military strategy?
Okay, yeah. So Cuban Missile Crisis is an intelligence challenge, right? You could say it's an intelligence failure. We stopped flying U-2 missions because we didn't want to create an environment where the Soviets would escalate. So we stopped flying U-2 missions, which meant we didn't understand what they were actually doing in Cuba. We had HUMINT that said they were doing it. In fact, the CIA had put out a cable saying that we felt something was going on in Cuba, which is finally why they did fly the U-2 mission. And that's how they did find the missiles. Throughout the Cuban Missile Crisis, we see a whole lack of coordination across the military. You have the Air Force going to DEFCON 3 at one base and launching a U-2 mission that should have been canceled, and that U-2 gets shot down by an SA-2, right? And the SA-2 we knew was a very capable weapon, but we had not understood if it was going to be used for ballistic missile defense or regular kind of air defense. McNamara in a memo or at a meeting says, hey, we think this is going to be ballistic missile defense. And that was a big deal, right? Because if you could now defeat a ballistic missile, your whole idea of mutually assured destruction is off, right? And we see this throughout the 70s, where any kind of ballistic missile defense kind of undermines the deterrence and containment strategy that we're really trying to use. And so that becomes a real challenge. And then, because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the RA-5C Vigilante is rushed out, and it actually flies 1 or 2 missions. At the same time, the P3 is rushed out as well, and it's conducting the barrier defense for that missile crisis, which it's then going to do in Vietnam, right, as part of market time, where they're going to be patrolling for steel-hulled trawlers that are bringing insurgency equipments in. And so all these things link, and they're a constant little fires here and there that we get into, and then we try to control the escalation ladder of each one of those. And it's all over. As the Soviets continue to expand their merchant program, and they're undercutting most of the merchant shipping industry because they're moving cargo for cheaper because they're state-sponsored. All of these things are part of that. Vietnam becomes a quagmire because we aren't in it to win it. We're in it to not start World War III. And so the decisions that are being made from the bombing campaign perspective, Westmoreland wants to destroy all their capability to fight, but Johnson wants to put enough pain on them that they'll quit fighting. Those two things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but they're difficult to do when your targeting philosophy is based on don't start World War III. You can't bomb the things that matter. You can't do that network analysis that really gets to the heart of this thing. And there's frustration in that because JCS and the president are writing the bombing targeting list. The only freedom they have is in truck interdiction, is what it ends up being called, right? Iron hand missions. And that's where Richardson says, I can make a difference here. We can use network analysis and we can actually make a difference. And we see that at the Tanho. So I think I bracketed some of your question, but the rest will have to wait. Sorry.
Hi, good evening, Captain. Thanks very much for the presentation. My name is John Dawson. I'm a former 1630 member of the review back. But my question was, my question from your presentation is sort of you were discussing at the outset how during the Vietnam War a real primary focus of naval intelligence was on supporting strike operations. But then moving past the Vietnam War, going into the later 70s, in the 80s, there was more and more of a focus on blue water, Opintel, on the tracking the Soviet fleet. So I was wondering, in the course of your research, if perhaps you could talk a little bit about, or if there were issues or challenges for the Navy, for naval intelligence, and perhaps in some ways being pulled a little bit in two directions, having to look both at supporting strike operations on land, but again, also having to focus on sort of blue water Opintel, focused on the Soviet fleet, and how that may have played into some of the organizational changes you were discussing. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the air war was a different performance orientation that was required of Navy intelligence, right? To support that air war, to support the technical intelligence analysis to defeat the SA-2 missile, as well as the integrated air defense system. In the South, they were dealing with an insurgency. And so market time, and then you have sea lords, and you have game warden, right? Those are all operations that are trying to stem the flow of supplies to the Viet Cong insurgency, right? It's a blockade. It's a close blockade. No one ever calls it that, but that's clearly what it is, right? We're flying to prevent things from moving into that area. We're blockading South Vietnam from that. And that becomes a human problem set. And the Navy is not prepared for that human system. The Army has a human collection capability. The Navy now needs to get one too. In fact, Norm Channel, Captain Norm Channel, who is one of the first Navy intelligence liaison officers, NILOs, that's in South Vietnam, he argues, hey, we don't need to create our own intel system, our human system. We're just going to use the Army's. And we start funneling some money, and in fact, Channel says, I became the first bag man in naval intelligence to carry money to pay off human assets in South Vietnam. We then create Task Force 157. Task Force 157 becomes a covert and mostly clandestine, but some covert work, human organization that lasts until somewhere in the 80s. And Task Force 157 becomes critical to Richardson in 6th Fleet for gathering intelligence as well. And so I talk a little bit about that. So there, now we have two performance orientations, right? We're sending Navy intelligence officers to the carrier to do air war. We're sending them in country to Vietnam to do that. Promotions are being dictated based on your performance. And what we see in the analysis of everybody that went to Vietnam, they almost had 100% promotion rate. If you served in Vietnam on the ground as a NILO, because you're elbow to elbow with the warfighter on land, you're going to probably promote, right? So that starts to shape the organization in itself. And then at the same time, we're still trying to keep track of all the Soviet submarines. And so the Maritime Patrol Forces, they have intel officers too, a whole different performance orientation, where they're focused on all source analysis to track these submarines so that they can say to their crew, the most likely area that they're operating in is here. And the tighter they can make that, the better it is for the aircrew. Because then they can trail an engine, fly over, saving fuel, get low, and now they can track that submarine, and they can stay on it. And the submarine knows they're being tracked because you can hear those Allison engines, and they know from their sonar system that they're being tracked. They're held at risk. And that becomes very important for that deterrence mechanism to work, is that they know wherever they go, something's tracking them. And that, I think, drives them into a defensive naval strategy, the Bastion strategy, which is something we called it, not something they ever called it. And we only know that the Bastion strategy exists, we believe it to exist, but we finally can prove it when Penkovsky reveals kind of the code to what we've been collecting. We've collected all of this intelligence from all of these new satellites that we have. We don't understand any of it. Penkovsky comes and gives us the code book and says, hey, here's what you're collecting, here's why it matters. And now we realize that they truly are a defensive force to protect the SSBNs, because that's their second strike capability, and that's what they view as the key to their deterrence and the key to their survival. The Blue Water Navy part that they have is really to create secondary areas of operation that split our forces. If they start operating in the Indian Ocean, where is the U.S. Navy going to go? Indian Ocean. So now there's less people, less ships to be focused on the Norwegian Sea and the North Atlantic, because now we have to send ships into the Indian Ocean. So it becomes a secondary threat strategy. It's not really a blue force thing. They never probably intended to defend and refight the third battle of the Atlantic, but they certainly were going to fight it, but that wasn't their primary mission. Their mission was to protect the ballistic missile submarines. Does that help you? Sir? Yeah.
Thanks. Could you talk about the SOSA system, how effective it was, and what percentage of the Soviet submarines you really moved where they will?
So we know SOSUS was very effective, and we know that it was a cornerstone of the OSIS system, right? So you had this sound, these hydrophones that were laid out across the bed of the ocean in certain positions, especially in choke points, so we could track the submarines through those. And that would help us cue, so that would help us find a submarine, and then we would fix the submarine by sending out a maritime patrol aircraft with buoys, who would then triangulate tactically in real time to then track that asset. I don't know what the percentage is. What I do know from my interviews of Maritime Patrol Force people, pilots and intelligence officers and those things, is that it became more and more difficult to track Soviet submarines as time went on in the 70s, partly because of Walker, but also because they had also stolen some sound quieting technologies that we had. So that became more and more difficult. The Navy, again, we're always trying to fix a problem, right? So the Navy starts to create special patrol aircraft. I served in a special projects squadron, VPU-1, but they also had a bear trap program. Bear trap, the bear, we're going to trap those bear submarines, had special acoustics equipment that was designed to look at different pressure variants. I know this because I found the contracts in the archives that lay out what they're trying to do. And bear trap was a big deal, and I can remember we still had bear trap squadrons when I was in 2000, when I was with VPU-1. We also then created signals intelligence collection platforms from the P-3. We had those during World War II. We decommissioned all of those, and then we realized in the 50s, late 50s, that, oh man, we're missing out on an airborne reconnaissance signals platform. And so They sent a bunch of chiefs into the DRMO, if you will, or the old junk piles to find all that equipment, buy it back up, and put it back into the planes. Those eventually become the VQ squadrons, which are a signals intelligence squadron. And so tracking submarines wasn't just about tracking the sound of the submarine, but HUMINT told us when they were going to leave, because the best way to track a submarine is start when you know where it is. It's leaving port. So if you have signals intelligence that talk about it leaving, now you know when to start and you know where to start. If you have HUMINT that talks about what they took on board so that you know how long they're going to be out, now you can start to lower that area, that search area that you're going to start with. And that becomes the whole plan. Does that help? Sure. I'm coming to you next.
Hi, thanks for this. I have another submarine question. Was there anything special or unique about the intel collection by our submarines on their submarines? And you can come at this from a, from an amateur point of view, from a number of angles, because we read about attack submarines chasing or trailing the Soviet submarines, and some things that happened. And we also have this notion that the submarine service was especially protective of the techniques, the abilities, etc. It kind of, you think they kind of operated almost as special forces. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I can talk a little bit. And here's why. In the beginning of the book, I talk about how I try to stay away from the intelligence itself, right? I kind of treat it as a black box. I talk about some systems that have been declassified. I talk about generalities, signals intelligence, imagery intelligence, HUMINT, but I really don't talk about any of the actual intelligence. The reason I did that is because when I started the project, again, I was in active duty, right? I was doing my PhD through King's College London. Fabulous program, highly recommend it. I ran into all kinds of problems. So I wanted to interview the submariners because, man, that's a great story, right? And that was really important. When I talked to the Submarine League, they were like, nobody wants to talk to you because they all signed non-disclosure agreements and they're afraid that you're going to reveal things. I was actually cautioned that I should change the topic of my dissertation because they felt that I was going to get myself in trouble. So I even laid out an entire part of my methodology of how I would deal with security issues, information security issues. And what I finally realized was it just was too hard. I put over 30 plus documents into the manual review system. I think I got 2 back. The rest are still stuck somewhere. So our declassification system is hampered, and I talk about it in the book a little bit, in many reasons, and because of that, I really did not get into the submarine area too much. What I do talk about is that Task Force 157 and Admiral Rectanus, who was then captain, and he was the Nav V4 N2 down in Saigon at the time, dealing with this insurgency problem. He did use submarines to collect intelligence off Shankosville in Cambodia. His argument was that's where the stuff was coming mainly from, down the delta. Of course, there was the steel hull trawlers coming. That was market time. But when it came to game warden, it was all coming from Cambodia. And it would come out, and then it would get into the delta, and then that's where they had to deal with it. Nobody would buy it. Nobody would believe it. And it wasn't until CIA finally produced a bill of lading that they had grabbed that proved that Cambodia was where all this stuff was coming from, that Rectanus was finally vindicated. And the director of CIA said, well, we have a little egg on our face because we didn't listen to him a year earlier. Right. So we do know the submarines were part of collection. And then we also know that, I think I talk a little bit about our submarines in the Mediterranean, tracking Soviet submarines, and that how valuable the 35 millimeter handheld camera photos that all the sighting teams on the ships were taking of the submarines when they would surface. because now we could create a guide, and we could figure out what that scar was on their acoustic tile, and we can say, oh, that, just like we track whales, right? Hey, they have that nick on their tail. Well, this submarine has a big scar where it scraped in the pier. Now we know that's K whatever. And so that began to help us keep track of these sightings, which really had inflated what the Soviet Navy was doing, because we thought they were everywhere. They really weren't. We just were looking at the same one over and over again. Sir?
Yeah, so my question is, how does the shift away from DuPont in the late Carter years and under Reagan affect U.S. naval strategy?
Okay, so when, under Carter, we did not shift away from DuPont. Carter was staunchly believing in DuPont. But he recognized that technology, digital technology, was going to become a second offset strategy. Carter never used that. That term really kind of came later under Bill Perry and them, where they started to think about ways, conventional ways, to create an offset to the quantitative superiority of the Soviets and the Warsaw Pact forces. So Carter does invest $8 billion in real funds into R&D as part of this second offset strategy. That sets the stage for Reagan to be able to capitalize on that, and for what we see in Desert Storm. And the integration assault breaker becomes that kind of the classic example of the netted sensor to weapons shooter capability that makes the Soviets realize that their deep battle strategy and the strategy of their maneuver forces in Europe isn't going to work anymore, because we have a way to defeat that conventionally without having to use nuclear weapons. So that's, I think, where that connection is.
Okay, we have to put out questions here, but Bryan is going to be out here signing copies of this book. We've got at least one or two boxes full, so we've got plenty of books there. I want to thank you, of course. Can't let you go without IWP coin. Appreciate it. There we go. He'll also be able to answer any questions we didn't get to answer them here. Yes,
Yep.
if you want to mention that.
One thing, I wrote an instructor's guide, so if anybody wants to use the book in a course, this instructor guide lays out by themes. There's 8 themes that I thought were important that you could, and it has learning outcomes, all of that stuff. It also has a full course laid out if you wanted to do a 12-session course. And then it has some seminars that you could do with activities and things. So,
if you want that, give me your card and I can send it to any instructors who want a copy of it.
yeah.
And if not, you'll have to wait for it to come out in Cliff Notes, which will be more expensive. So, all right. Thanks, Bryan.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Okay. So just real